Donald Trump has been found guilty of falsifying business records to cover up the hush money he paid to bury a sex scandal. It's the first time a former president has been found guilty of a crime or a major party nominee has become a convicted felon, all in an election year.
It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here.
So what does this mean for the presidential race? And will it make a difference to Trump's popularity with voters across the United States? I'm Tom Cheshire, and this is the Sky News Daily. Let's get straight into it. With me now is Sky's US correspondent, James Matthews. James, you've been there since the start of this trial. What was that moment like when 34 guilty verdicts come back in?
It was dramatic, Tom. I've covered a few court verdicts in my time. This one, we had no video cameras in court. There are still cameras that were allowed in at the start of each day, and you will have seen these pictures of Donald Trump and defence team. But in terms of the news from inside, that came out via a live text feed. So we were watching the laptop screen. It was the end of day 2 of deliberations, 4:30, and the text feed was telling us the judge, Juan Merchan, was about to send the jury home. So the world's media were set to pack up. Then came the text feed that the judge had actually reached a verdict. So they'd reached a verdict, they said. Give us 30 minutes to fill out the paperwork, and they duly filed into court. And from my experience, watching the laptop screen, suddenly that column marked guilty was populated by a series of ticks, one after the other, 34 guilty verdicts. So dramatic indeed. And outside court, there was a hush when people realised the verdict was on its way. There was a ripple of cheering from people who were anti-Trump, as the news spread amongst their number, dozens of them. And of course there were Trump supporters as well. For them, I would say a strident defiance, but certainly an air of resigned despair.
So it sounds like it's been a pretty noisy affair. I mean, this is, in the full glare of the cameras, these crowds, they're chanting things outside. What's that atmosphere been like?
Interestingly, the atmosphere was there at the start, and the numbers were there at the start in terms of people who were supporting Trump, people who were against. There's a park opposite this criminal court building, and both sides are separated by police barriers. So they were certainly noisy. And there were general numbers at the beginning of the court case in terms of a media presence. Interestingly, over the course of the 5 weeks, that thinned out, and it kind of settled into what I would regard as normal court case coverage. Bear in mind that this story has been told over many months, more than a year indeed. Through the media, we have learned the story of Stormy Daniels, Michael Cohen, the accusations related to Donald Trump's defence on a regular basis. So in many respects, we'd heard the story before, but come the verdict, then the media supporters, opponents were there in considerable numbers because, of course, it was a huge event with huge significance, nothing less, perhaps, than a jury's verdict that could shape the forthcoming presidential election.
What an explosive moment, a historic moment. Beyond today, what does it mean for the next months? Can we even say, it's going to be extraordinary fallout, right?
It's extremely significant for the coming months up until the presidential election. I am standing in Trump Tower, the foyer, amidst 100 more members of the media, an extremely busy press conference, to hear Donald Trump's latest comeback. Let's have a listen to how that went down.
So I'm the leading person for president, and I'm under a gag order by a man that can't put two sentences together, given by a court, and they are in total conjunction with the White House and the DOJ, just so you understand. This is all done by Biden and his people, and nobody's ever seen anything like it. So we have a judge who's highly conflicted. You know what the confliction is. Nobody wants to write about it, and I'm not allowed to talk about it. If I do, he said, I get put in jail. As far as the trial itself, it was very unfair. We weren't allowed to use our election expert under any circumstances. You saw what happened to some of the witnesses that were on our side. They were literally crucified by this man who looks like an angel, but he's really a devil. He looks so nice and soft. People say, oh, he seems like such a nice man. No, unless you saw him in action.
So I think clearly this is an occasion for him to try to shape the narrative, to steer the story in his direction. He's already been on Truth Social this morning talking about how it was a legal expense and talking about how his lawyer was taking care of the paperwork that ultimately landed him in trouble. I suppose the question would be, why put that on Truth Social the day after you've been found guilty? Why not take the stand and introduce that into the case as part of your testimony, which of course Donald Trump said he would do. He said he'd take the stand and ultimately never did. But for Trump, not for the first time, it's a question of shaping the narrative to his benefit. And who's to say that he won't be in a position to do that? Remember, he has a solid base of support. Remember, he is neck and neck with Joe Biden in the polls ahead in key swing states. So there is a substantial portion of the electorate, numbers that he will think he can play with and carry behind him on that journey. Don't forget, this is a man who has been found guilty in courts before, this time in a criminal court, but previously in civil courts, liable for sexual abuse, business fraud. In the sexual abuse case, the judge called that rape by his classifications.
His narrative, what you're talking about, how he's going to frame this, he's been saying this is the Democrats bringing a case, this is politically motivated all the way through. And, you know, it's tempting to sort of say, well, that's just the narrative he's saying. But does he have a point? Compared to those serious cases, this is a bit flimsier, I think some people have argued. It's a different system in America where you do have a district attorney who's elected, who campaigns on a particular promise, in this case, a Democrat promising to prosecute Trump. Does he have any point in that? Are these charges, you know, what you'd expect? This was what he was going to get done on when all those other serious crimes you've talked about?
I suppose ultimately, Tom, you know, who would argue with 12 members of the public, 12 members, 7 men and 5 women who sat on that New York jury, because that was the jury of his peers, and ultimately that's what American justice comes down to, as does British justice, members of the public. But yeah, there are questions, and I suppose the American system is laid open to questions, criticism perhaps, because the key players are elected. They are political. Alvin Bragg, the district attorney, prosecutor-in-chief who brought this case, he's a Democrat. So you can see why Trump and supporters pointed to him. And it was a criticism waiting to happen, an accusation that this was a politically motivated witch hunt. It's also worth noting that, yes, this case ended up in court. There was a prosecution. The prosecutors in New York had looked at taking it to court in the past and discounted the notion. So that fed into this accusation that it was a political stitch-up driven by one individual in particular, Alvin Bragg, who Donald Trump roundly criticized over many months. Called him a psychopath. Alvin Bragg, he was subject to death threats and so on. So that all got extremely ugly. But I think ultimately the story played out in court in detail. And it is for the court of public opinion, I suppose. Electors in America who will elect their next president, perhaps it's only just and fair that they should hear the story of the individual running to regain the White House. And I suppose in many ways, you know, beyond the legal and criminal aspects of it all, there is the business of being across the detail, the importance of American voters to know the background, to be given an insight into Donald Trump, the way he operates. And it was, a grubby tale about a one-night stand with a porn star and an operation, a hush money scheme perpetrated by a parcel of rogues. You know, David Pecker, former publisher of the National Enquirer, an absolute tabloid rascal who brought us headlines like, you know, alien invaders seized our trailer park. He got together with Trump, big pals, told Trump he would catch and kill negative stories, promote positive stories about Donald Trump. There was a key meeting in Trump Tower between Pecker, Trump himself and Michael Cohen, Donald Trump's lawyer. And prosecutors said that was the heart of the scheme. A scheme essentially to spread misinformation, to spin positive news coverage, media coverage about Donald Trump, essentially to gaslight the American electorate at large and to hoodwink voters into backing Donald Trump. So, yes, there is the criminal case, there are the legal arguments, but there also is a broader discussion that Americans can now have about Donald Trump, the man, his background, how appropriate is he to regain office. So many would argue that that's appropriate and absolutely what American voters deserve to hear.
The extraordinary thing I was reading, I think in the New York Times, that obviously we haven't got to sentencing yet. It's unlikely to be a jail sentence. There's going to be appeals, all of that. But if Trump were sentenced to jail, he'd have to take the Secret Service into prison with him. I mean, that's an extraordinary state of affairs that sort of sums the whole thing up, I think.
Yeah, that would be the question. If he was going to be sent to jail, as you say, that almost certainly will not happen. Technically, he could face up to 4 years behind bars, but realistically, it will be something far less than that. At the lower end of the sentencing scale, probation is an option for the judge, and it will be closer to that. He won't be behind bars because he is a non-violent first-time offender. But should that be the scenario, and nobody can rule it out 100%, then yeah, there would be all sorts of questions about security, Secret Service. Does he go behind bars? What prison would be most appropriate? How do you accommodate somebody in that kind of situation? And it was a question during the course of the trial, of course, because Donald Trump breached the gag order. There came the point where the judges said to him, stop talking about witnesses and jurors, but Donald Trump continued to do that, and he was fined $10,000. And there came the point where the judge says, look, if you don't stop doing that, I'm not going to fine you anymore. It will be some kind of incarceration. So the Secret Service were contemplating what they would have to do, what the options would be. Would it be a holding cell inside the criminal court building? The mayor of New York said, look, we've got Rikers Island. That is where New York keeps its crooks. And Eric Adams said, look, we stand ready to accommodate Donald Trump if it should come to that. So all sorts of scenarios were being contemplated during the trial. I suppose technically similar scenarios have to be contemplated right now. What a sight it would be, Donald Trump taken to prison. But that isn't going to happen. Nobody's expecting that. But I suppose the question is, what does probation involve? Somebody committing that level of offence, typically another member of the public might expect to be cleaning the streets with the hazmat top on, with the helmet and so on. We've seen Boy George in New York doing that very same thing. So, there are possibilities, but I think we have to be realistic. It's Donald Trump. He's running for the presidency. Security needs to follow him wherever he goes. And I think, New York will be keeping it real when it comes to the sentencing of a presidential candidate.
That's an amazing image, the idea of Trump clearing the streets, presumably with a huge security detail in front of him already clearing the streets. When it comes to voters, what do you think they are going to make? There's a base, obviously, that isn't going to move at all. But those independent voters, perhaps those sort of more moderate Republicans, do you think there's an effect there?
There will be a shifting of opinion. The polls tell us that. There will be no shift in the MAGA base. Donald Trump carries that with him to the polls in November. No indication that will shift. But independent voters, moderate voters, softer Republicans, the polls indicate, and particularly in key swing states where Donald Trump is ahead in those polls, there are indications that a conviction, a candidate tainted by a criminal conviction in court, that would shift their vote. That would make them turn towards Joe Biden. So that will be key. That will be interesting to see how that plays out.
Thanks so much, James. We'll take a quick break. Afterwards, we'll hear from political commentator and Trump biographer Michael Wolff. Welcome back. With me now is Michael Wolff. Michael, we've heard from Donald Trump after the conviction. He was enraged. He called the trial rigged, the judge corrupt. You've actually been in the courtroom the whole time. What's it been like, and what has the former president been like throughout the process?
He did say this after the conviction, but he has said this also every day. So rigged and corrupt is just part of his way of saying good morning and good evening. And I've been in there every day for 6 weeks, and it has been both monotonous and riveting. The prosecution gave an extraordinarily coherent and vivid portrait of a bunch of no good nicks with Donald Trump at the center, carrying out various small time but also nefarious plans. And the defense countered this with, I think their entire defense was to deny even the undeniable. So it certainly came as no surprise to me, having heard exactly what the jury heard all these weeks, that they came to the logical conclusion, guilty on all counts.
Did it come as a surprise to Trump himself? I mean, there's a lot of bluster, all the fundraising, the 5D chess, perhaps this helps him, but he wanted to win this, right?
Well, of course he wanted to win this, and he thought, yes, of course he would win this just because he's Donald Trump, and he always wins, and winning is the name of the game. So now, actually, what that means is that he has to figure out a way to turn this into a win.
So I don't think there are many people in the world who've studied Donald Trump as closely as you have. Does he just convince himself that he'll get through this, that actually he'll get to the election and that he'll win that election now, despite everything?
Well, yeah, he does, and with some basis. I mean, he gets through seemingly everything. I mean, he gets through so much that would have flattened virtually any other normal person, even any other politician who might be somewhat less than normal. No one could survive what he has gone through. So he believes, of course, he will survive this again, and that he might very well become the president again, which he might very well.
When you're inside the courtroom watching it, as you say, monotonous but also riveting, what do you think it was that resonated most with the jury about the evidence that was presented?
I think the evidence was extraordinarily clear. I mean, clearly fudged these records. There could have been no doubt by any reasonable mind that was not exactly what happened. Then the question was, could you connect this to trying to fool people in the context of running for president? And he clearly was running for president. This clearly would have been an issue if it had come to light while he was running for president. Therefore, guilty on all 34 counts. So I don't think that in the minds of this jury, and I will point out that this jury was a Manhattan jury. This jury was very much predisposed to convict Donald Trump. On that score, he is absolutely correct. But they did convict him, and they convict him for very logical reasons.
We knew a lot of this story before, but having it laid out forensically like that, those sort of lurid details, having that all laid out methodically in front of the whole of the USA, what do you think that means for public perception?
I think it means virtually nothing, that people who hate Trump will be ever more confirmed in their hatred, and people who love Trump will be ever more confirmed in their belief that the powers that be and the system is against him and trying to prevent him from becoming president once again. So therefore, nothing will have changed.
Not even in the middle with, maybe those slight swing voters, independent voters, or very moderate.
Well, that's the swing voters I would call that the myth of the swing voters. And I think at the end of the day, there are very few of them. But yes, let's say there is a crucial 0.5% out there. Will this have a determinative effect? 5 months more to this election is a long time. And in Donald Trump time, there are many, many more times for many more explosions and distractions.
5 months to go. If you're the Biden campaign, if you're going to be in especially a presidential debate against Donald Trump, now a convicted felon, if you're Joe Biden, do you mention that? How do you use that to your advantage?
I'm not exactly sure. And if I were in Joe Biden's debate prep, I would certainly raise the question, what does that get anyone? It just invites Donald Trump to say that he's a convicted felon because of Joe Biden, which he would inevitably say, and may even say that without Joe Biden bringing this up.
Michael Wolff, thank you for your time. That's it for today's Daily. We'll be back next week. I'm Tom Cheshire. Bye for now.